All right, thank you for joining us tonight on another Socialist Action Monday night webinar. We've been doing these every Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, bringing you fantastic panels of speakers on all the big topics of the day. And today we have with us Socialist Action's presidential candidate, Jeff Mackler. Who is here to talk about the campaign and the COVID-19 pandemic and the massive worldwide, nationwide movement of anti-racism and police brutality protests. So let's start with that. Thanks for being here, Jeff. We are seeing these protests happening in over 2,000 cities and towns in all 50 states nationwide and around the world. This is an unprecedented movement of anti-racist protests across the country. How do you explain this new uprising?
Thank you, Nick Brennan, for being with us for this interview. Use the word unprecedented. They were, before literally a couple of months ago, unprecedented, unthinkable, unimaginable. In my lifetime, I've never seen anything like the massive nature, the deepest anger ever in the face of not only a pandemic that threatens the lives of millions, it's taken the lives of 120,000 Americans, but these same people in the millions took to the streets, regardless of the dangers, to join with the struggles of Black, Latinx, and Native Americans protesting the ingrained race of American society and stood side by side with them. You know, in all of the conventions that Socialist Action has had over the years, we usually begin with a simple proposition that our times are marked by a giant contradiction between the deep anger and frustration of the American people at the conditions of their daily lives, at their lack of health care, jobs, racism, poverty, unemployment, endless wars, on the one hand, and the relative passivity of working people in the US and worldwide. We bemoaned our fate. Here, these attacks are deeper than ever, and yet the response was minimal. We said that this contradiction had to be resolved, but we didn't know when. And year after year, we knew it was coming, but never when. And then, in the face of the worst pandemic of 100 years that has afflicted 2 million Americans and counting, with 120,000 dead already and 200,000 expected to be dead by the end of the year, and the entire nation, roughly speaking, quarantined in their houses, fearful of going into the streets, justifiably concerned for their very lives, in a matter of days, those same people broke with their quarantine and joined their Black brothers and sisters when one single individual, George Floyd, was murdered by a racist cop in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And in short order, Breonna Taylor was similarly murdered, virtually in her sleep, when the police ramrodded her door open, looking for the wrong person, opened fire and filled her body with 8 bullets. And then the same thing with jogger in Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery, who was murdered by 2 ex-cops in a planned execution. And then Rayshard Brooks, standing in line, falling asleep in his car at a Wendy's and shot in the back dead. These sparked the deepest outpouring of hatred of repression and racism in my lifetime. It became known almost instantly that these four were just representatives of the literal daily police murders of unarmed Black men for years. On average, one a day. We didn't hear about them, but now we know. How do we explain what happened? Literally, before the COVID-19 pandemic broke, we were told that we were in good times, that President Trump was likely to be reelected, that the unemployment rate was the lowest in 50 years, if not more, that prosperity was around the corner, that was with us, that the stock market was booming, that corporate profits were high, that we had the longest expansion ever. And literally, in a matter of days, this veil of stability was torn off, revealing the horror confronting working people. The real unemployment rate, or as the government says, the labor participation rate, was close to 50%. That is, half the working class had no jobs, or if they did, they were in the gig economy, low wage sector, where the average worker, they said, could barely meet an unexpected $400 bill. That a quarter or half of the workers couldn't pay their rent. The stability disappeared overnight, and it was most affected by the Black community, who died triple the rate from the virus than the white community. And then came the bailout, $2.3 trillion, 457 billion of which went to literally a handful of billionaires. And the overwhelming majority to the rest, the giant corporations of the world, were bailed out to the tune of billions, while working people at best got a $1,200 one-time pittance, which was barely enough to get through the month. So we began to realize that this veil of stability gave way to a society in crisis. It was not the lowest unemployment rate. As it turned out, it's the highest unemployment rate in the history of the United States. 45 million people over the course of literally 3 or 4 or 5 weeks filed for unemployment insurance. And the government was compelled, but put limits on the unemployment payment, and now is stopping them at the end of this month in order to drive poor people back to the factories to produce profits for the bosses who have sustained unbelievable losses. But unbelievable? Literally, a combination of the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve have provided funds to bail out the corporate elite to the tune of virtually 100% of all their losses over the first quarter. Unbelievable. $6-7 trillion, a quarter of the nation's GDP, which is $23 trillion, has gone to the coffers of the rich, and peanuts for the poor. But they still needed a workforce. So they basically said, you're going back to work, whether you have masks or not, whether there's testing or not. And to begin the process, they said it was safe because the rate of COVID infections was only increasing on a graphic plane, that is a horizontal plane. They didn't bother telling us that the plane indicated an average daily new increase in COVID infections of 22,000. So back to work it was, despite the warnings of the Fauci doctors and scientists around the world. And literally, as soon as the states began sending workers back to unprotected conditions, the spike, the second wave, Fauci says it's really part of the first wave, began. And we now see the average rate of new infections at close to 30,000 every day. And the death rate inevitably increases. And yet the bosses say, back to work, back to work, back to work, because our profits come first and your lives are subordinate to it. So here we have our party, Socialist Action, defending workers' rights, saying we have the right to continue the quarantine, to improve medical care, to test everybody. And literally a day later, millions came into the streets, risking their lives to join with their Black, Latino, Latinx, and Native brothers and sisters, to engage in the biggest, deepest struggle for civil rights against racist bigotry in the nation's history. We truly live in unprecedented times.
You mentioned that the numbers of coronavirus cases every day are now rising to approaching the levels of the heights of the pandemic in the US in April. We're seeing 30,000 new cases per day, and numbers that are rising sharply in many states. What is your analysis of what we're seeing in this pandemic and the government's approach to it?
Well, you have to wonder why the Trump administration is arguing that we have to go back to work. This is and that all 50 states, protestations of Trump's views notwithstanding, are complying. Why? Why send people to their death? Especially now that it's proven. In doing so, you've increased the number of cases and the number of deaths, if not the death rate. Fauci, in charge of the medical epidemiological aspect of it, says we're not only not ready for the second wave, but we haven't finished the first wave. We've only tested perhaps 5% of the population. The Chinese in the Wuhan province where the pandemic broke out have tested virtually the entire population. And they register new infections at the rate of a handful, one or none a day, whereas we have 30,000 new infections a day. Why? The answer is simple. The Trump administration is practicing what scientists call herd immunity. And that is send people to their potential death, let them be affected. Only 95% will die. The rest will supposedly develop some immunity, which is questionable. The scientific community says that the immunity that they can record to date is only partial. But meanwhile, even if we lose 200,000, 300,000, or 500,000 people, the remaining group will basically have a natural immunity like you get when you have a vaccine for polio or the other common diseases. So the government basically says the lives of 250,000 people are subordinate to the billions of dollars in profit that the remaining workers can produce at the point of production. It's a calculated risk. It's, by the way, they're saying, well, we don't have to send everybody exactly to the conditions before. We can manage it. We can slowly open the schools. We can have smaller classes. We can spread them out over a longer period of time. We can space the workers in the factories, like in the meatpacking plants owned by Tyson, where previously they had immigrant workers, the poorest of the poor, standing elbow to elbow, some with fevers, vomiting on the production lines, cutting up pigs for the meat market, disregarding the result of working people. The same thing in the poorest of the poor, in the rest homes, in the prisons, where the pandemic has the highest rates of infection and death. It's a calculated risk. It's the kind of risk that the ruling class takes in the days of slavery. You can work the slaves as much as you can, but you can't kill them all because they are your source of gold. In the days of slavery, they were the major source of income that built this country. So yes, it's a terrible calculation the herd immunity calculation, where the deaths of hundreds of thousands are subordinate to the profits of the few, because the ruling class and everybody else with a grain of sense knows that no self-respecting worker capitalist would hire a worker. A capitalist would hire a worker if they didn't profit for them. Profits are contingent on the exploitation of human labor. So here you have a mathematical equation, which, by the way, the Boris Johnson government of the UK had a study, and they literally calculated if they send everybody back to work, they would lose a certain percentage, but it was acceptable. It was only after Johnson himself almost died that the government decided to back off under pressure from the public for contempt for his decision. Others around the world did the same thing. The Italians, the second highest rate of infection is in Brazil, where the Bolsonaro government, a close US ally and Trump ally, basically said this pandemic is irrelevant, get back to work. And Brazil, with the largest economy, had the most to lose for the rich. And the result is the infection rates are the highest. It's the same thing around the world. What's amazing, even more amazing than the pandemic, is the fact that in the face of the world's worst pandemic in 100 years, millions are breaking the quarantine early on without even masks in half of the demonstrators to protest the racism that is ingrained in our society. It's a racism that hasn't gone away and that can't be reformed. The size and scope of the demonstrations have shocked the ruling rich as never before in our history. Everything that was sacred yesterday becomes the rule today. Every state government says, yes, we need police reform. They have torn down, either by the demonstrators of the states and governments, the statues of the racist slavocracy who were honored by statues across the nation. And in the halls of Congress, Nancy Pelosi suddenly recognized that they were decorated with the leaders of the racist slavocracy confederacy. Jefferson Davis's statue came down literally a day or so, the head of the secessionist slavocracy. The laws that were on the books were evaporated instantly. Police chiefs resigned across the country. Ingrained and systemic racism was agreed to. And they said, we have to change it. They even went so far as to have joint legislation that is pending in Congress by Democrats and Republicans saying we need police reform. And now there is a consideration of a bill making Juneteenth, the day that slavery was finally announced ended in 1865 in Texas, a national holiday, with the idea that maybe declaring a national holiday would solve the problem. But in the face of these promises by politicians on both sides of the aisle, the demonstrations continue, unprecedented, daily, to the point where a panicked president, literally, with demonstrators throughout Washington, in the face of massive police protection, the president's staff ordered that he go down in a hole in the ground in his fortified bunker with his family to protect his own self. He later denied it, saying, lo and behold, he just went down for an inspection. And then in order to show his courage, he literally ordered the police and National Guard to clear a peaceful protest of the media, of the clergy, of black and white protesters with arms, clubbing people, imprisoning them en masse, and then marching down the street with his top general, Millay, saying he's in charge now, as if to declare martial law in the country for his 1-minute Bible holding upside down, I might add, presentation escorted by the police and armed forces to give a speech before St. John's Church. Unbelievable. And the generals, including the Secretary of Defense, who marched with him, General Millay, said it was a mistake for him to be there in military fatigues. And he cautioned the president that sending the nation's soldiers, 43% of whom are people of color, said Millay, to crush peaceful demonstrators would send the wrong message. Not now, he said. We don't need to do that now, as if it were acceptable or would be acceptable in the future. And even the Secretary of Defense said he didn't know where he was going with the president, that it was a mistake. And they cautioned the president against using force.
The last thing we wanted to talk about tonight was the election that's coming up in November. As we mentioned, you're running for president as Socialist Action's candidate. And before Trump's rally in Tulsa this past weekend, the election had largely disappeared from the headlines. Joe Biden was basically out of sight. What is your take on the current presidential election campaign?
I can give you a firsthand experience, Nick. On Friday, Juneteenth, I went to a protest called within a few days' notice in Oakland's Oscar Grant Plaza. It was renamed such because Oscar Grant was slaughtered at a BART station, a train station in Fruitvale, at the Fruitvale station by police. And the demonstration was called by over a dozen unions, and especially by all the ILWU, that is the longshore unions, up and down the coast, who organized a 8-hour West Coast longshore strike to commemorate George Floyd's life and stand in opposition to racism. So at 80, I was a little concerned. I put on a mask and parked my car nearby and went to the demonstration. And lo and behold, there were 5,000 people there. They were chanting Black Lives Matter. They were chanting for the liberation of Black people. So I approached them. I had my Socialist Action newspaper, a picture of myself on a postcard, vote Jeff Mackler, and our killer cops must be jailed, or something like that. And I approached people, and the first question I asked was, interested in socialist ideas? And they looked me in the eye, who is this strange old man? And they said, yes. And I said, well, I'm Jeff Mackler, holding up the postcard. I'm running for president against a guy named Donald Trump and Joseph Biden. And the reaction was, right on. You got my support. And as I did this for 2 hours, going through a whole crowd, I realized that virtually everybody there was interested in socialism. What did the crowd look like? They were 2/3 Black, 100% were wearing masks. There was 1/3 white, Latino, and Asian American, and they readily took my campaign literature, hundreds of flyers, postcards, newspapers, and they signed up on our mailing list with a number saying they wanted to join. That's an experience I haven't had in a lifetime, not in years, not in decades, but in a lifetime. Everybody has begun to understand that there's something fundamentally wrong with capitalism, not just its ingrained systemic racism, but its inequality across the board, its rotten jobs, its unemployment rates, its low wages, its massive layoffs, its unemployment, its unpayable rents and unpayable student debts. In the case of young people of color, they're victims of the school to prison scenario, wherever segregated, underfunded schools graduate, in quotes, near majorities of functionally illiterate students channeled into the ever-privatized for-profit prison industrial complex to work at Fortune 500 companies for an average wage of 50 cents. And Georgia and Mississippi don't pay at all. We have a return in our prison system to slave labor. This is a system that affects the entire population. The United States incarcerates more and a greater percentage of its population than anyone on earth. The kids at that demonstration were aware of the racist nature of the segregated schools, but also the white kids too. They're affected by the low wage, insecure, flexible work, never know when you're going to be at work jobs. So I saw a flowering of interest in socialist ideas and a relative indifference to the presidential election. For the first time, aside from Trump's virtual no-show rally where he couldn't fill the stadium with 18,000, I understand it was a third empty, and the crowds expected outside were near zero. They canceled the rally. And it was ridiculed by the corporate media. But the interest in Joe Biden, he was put there as the Southern racist anti-busing bigot to balance President Obama's campaign. They're looking for someone to do the same thing with Joe Biden. The anti-busing, leader and author of President Clinton's, when he was in the Senate, when Biden was in the Senate, criminalizing legislation that opened the door to the mass incarceration of Blacks was Biden's doing. Traditionally, the Democrats put on their slate a Northern liberal and a Southern racist bigot. That was John F. Kennedy on the one hand and the segregationist Lyndon Johnson in his day. But when Nixon won the Democratic Party of the South to the Republican Party, the Democrats didn't have anybody, couldn't win any electoral votes. So they turned out to the sons and families of the former Southern slaveocracy. Jimmy Carter was decided on as the Democratic Party candidate in Georgia. A former open segregationist racist went to a segregated church, and his first legislation as a school board member was to implement school busing so white kids didn't have to walk by Black schools. And then they had Al Gore, whose father was an open segregationist in his day in Tennessee. And Bill Clinton came from Arkansas, I believe. They had to run a Southerner to try to pick up a few of the former votes that were previously the secure property of the racist South. So the electoral process is in a shamble. Everybody realizes it doesn't make much of a difference who's elected president. They have no confidence in the so-called centrist or conservative Democrat, Joe Biden. Joe Biden recently called for $300 million more for the police. He has nothing to lose by moving as close to Trump. Yes, we have a choice today. It's a choice between the Democrats and Republicans, and it's finally come down to whether or not we have Hitler or Mussolini in power. Of course, the Democrats are pressing for the lesser evil because we must save ourselves from Donald Trump. What we really need is to break with both of the parties of racism and capitalism, build the socialist movement, unite the oppressed in the streets, fight for democratic community control by the oppressed of their own communities, and find a way to cement the unity that is emerging for the first time in my lifetime between Black and white and the oppressed and Latinos and working people and immigrants to challenge this rotten capitalist system. Our party is growing. Join us. We need this new generation of youth to continue the struggle, to deepen it, to institutionalize it in fighting organizations of working people, to change the rotten course that capitalism has taken the nation on.
Thank you very much for being with us, Jeff Mackler, National Secretary of Socialist Action, who we are very proud to have as our 2020 presidential candidate. If you've enjoyed this video, check us out at socialistaction.org. You can also find many more great webinars that we've done here on our YouTube page. And of course, vote Socialist Action in November. Thank you for being with us. All right.